Hello and welcome to the Cheeky Science Show. So Nature Aging officially launched last week, and so in this video I thought I'd discuss one of their review topics, intermittent and periodic fasting, longevity and disease. And so this review was primarily written by Folta Longo, who's been researching the role of fasting for a long time. And so in this video we'll begin by looking at the different types of fasting and address the underlying molecular mechanisms that happen when you fast. And then we'll look at some of the animal models and then go into some of the human data that shows the impact of different fasting regimens. And lastly, I want to go into a bit more detail about the importance of refeeding and the role of stem cells after the fasting period, and how this might be important in terms of understanding the differences in efficacy between intermittent and periodic fasting. And also briefly, we'll take a look at how diet composition is also important. So there's lots of information to jump into in this video, but firstly I just want to make a quick disclaimer that I am not trying to suggest the fasting methods described here, and you should definitely consult your doctor before trying anything. The aim of this video is merely for a discussion, not practical advice. So first then, what is fasting and what is the difference between intermittent and periodic fasting? So in humans, fasting is achieved by ingesting none or a minimal amount of food for periods that can range from 12 hours up to 3 weeks. And so fasting is very different to calorie restriction, which is when the daily caloric intake is reduced chronically by 20 to 40%. And it's also very different to starvation, which is chronic nutritional insufficiency. So what's the difference between intermittent fasting and periodic fasting? Well, they differ mainly in the duration of the fast. So for intermittent fasting, these are much shorter time periods, which can range from 12 hours in time-restricted feeding up to a 24-hour fast, seen in alternate day fasting. And intermittent fasting also includes the 5-2 diet, whereby there's a 5-day eating period with a 2-day fast, or 2 days where there's a very low calorie consumption. And so as you can see in this table here, there are a variety of different intermittent fasting diets. And so in contrast, periodic fasting refers to a prolonged and severely calorie restricted or water only fasting period, lasting in most cases between 48 hours and a week, but longer time periods up to 21 days have been investigated. And so the key difference between periodic fasting and intermittent fasting is that periodic fasting can occur at specific intervals, or like a kind of as needed basis, and is usually carried out less than once every 2 weeks. And the two major methods of periodic fasting include a water-only periodic fast, or a so-called fasting mimicking diet that was originally termed by Folta, which is a plant-based caloric restricted diet containing low proteins, low sugar, and high unsaturated fats that are able to mimic the same effects as fasting only with water. So what are these effects? Well, the major source of energy in our bodies is glucose, and the majority of glucose is stored in our liver, where it is stored as glycogen. When there's increased physical activity, or at the onset of a fast, this liver glycogen gets broken down into glucose so that it can be used as a fuel of energy. Once the liver glycogen is depleted, other sources are used instead. This includes pyruvate and fat-derived glycerol and amino acids that occur in a process known as gluconeogenesis. And then as the fasting continues, there is the breakdown of fatty acids for energy. And this breakdown of fatty acids is referred to as ketogenesis. And effectively, it's a metabolic pathway that produces so-called ketone bodies, which is an alternative form of energy for the body. And so during fasting, there effectively is a metabolic switch from liver-derived glucose to adipose-derived ketone bodies. And so typically, the level of ketone bodies in the plasma is around 100 to 250 micromolars. However, this can increase up to 1 millimolar during a prolonged fast. However, due to the acidic nature of the ketone bodies, acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate, high levels of ketone bodies, around 20 millimolars, can result in ketoacidosis, which is not something that you want. So why would there potentially be benefits from fasting? Well, this alternative metabolic pathway is thought to be focused more on being able to conserve energy and to protect the organism while enduring extended periods of food deprivation. And this is to optimize survival and reproduction once food becomes available again. In terms of the molecular mechanisms, a reduction in the amino acids and glucose present reduces the signaling through mTOR, known as the mammalian target of rapamycin, that promotes growth within a cell. Moreover, a reduction in glucose reduces signaling through the RAS pathway that also promotes growth. In addition to amino acids and glucose, insulin levels also reduce during fasting, along with IGF-1, which is the insulin-like growth factor. Moreover, indirect effects of fasting alter the ratio of different metabolites, including the ratio of coenzyme A to acetyl-CoA, NAD+ to NADH, and AMP to ATP. And these metabolites can affect, directly or indirectly, the epigenetic marks within a cell. For example, it can increase SIRT1 activity due to an increase in the levels of NAD+, and this can instead promote in a cell stress resistance pathways, along with an upregulation of proteostasis and autophagy. And so this all helps enable cells to be able to survive when nutrients are scarce, and instead help to recycle and repair damaged cellular components. And so reasons why this might be beneficial comes in line with all of the previous data I've spoken about on this channel regarding different potential supplements, such as rapamycin that inhibits mTOR, along with resveratrol that activates sirtuins, such as SIRT1, and NAD+ precursors that also help to increase SIRT1 activity. And inhibiting or activating these different proteins have been shown in a variety of different model organisms to have beneficial impacts in terms of both health span and lifespan. And so maybe unsurprisingly then, this metabolic switch that occurs during fasting and this alteration in the intracellular signaling pathways has been shown in studies to extend lifespan of bacteria, yeast, worms, and mice. And so this review article doesn't really touch on these different supplements, but I will briefly talk about them at the end and their implications with fasting, in particular in terms of the refeeding process. So now let's take a look more specifically at the benefits of fasting, and in particular try to compare between intermittent fasting and periodic fasting. And interestingly, Sachin Panda is, in my mind, one of the major researchers in terms of intermittent fasting, whereas Volta Longo seems to focus more in his research on periodic fasting. So that I just found interesting anyway. So I initially learned about fasting by reading The Circadian Code by Sachin Panda. And so he talks a lot about time-restricted feeding, which is one of these forms of intermittent fasting. And so understanding the benefits of that tries to bring in the importance of food timing with the circadian rhythm, and how different processes within our bodies happen at certain times of the day, and how eating plays into that. And the study that always comes to mind when I think about the benefits of time-restricted feeding is this Cell Metabolism paper. Time-restricted feeding without reducing caloric intake prevents metabolic diseases in mice fed on a high-fat diet. So despite eating the same amount of calories, mice on the time-restricted feeding diet, whereby they were eating for 8 hours per day, were protected against obesity, hyperinsulinemia, inflammation, and they also had improved motor coordination compared to mice that were just eating ad libitum. And they go on to show that this effect was potentially mediated by enhanced oscillations of the circadian clock and the target gene expression. And so given the beneficial effects seen in this study, they then went and studied time-restricted feeding in patients with metabolic syndrome, and they also showed similar cardiometabolic benefits. For example, the time-restricted feeding prevented excessive body weight gain, improved sleep, and attenuated age and diet-induced deterioration in cardiac performance, and it also improved blood pressure. A different study that looked at the benefits of the 5-2 intermittent fasting diet showed that comparing overweight women that either followed the 5-2 diet or a 25% calorie-restricted diet, they lost the same amount of weight, but those in the 5-2 diet had a greater increase in insulin sensitivity. So there seems to be purported benefits of intermittent fasting. However, there's also studies that do suggest that the risk of gallstone disease nearly doubles between women who fast for 8 hours per day and those who fast for over 14 hours per day, although this study is quite old and was quite a small sample size. However, it should definitely be further investigated. Moreover, another study showed that skipping breakfast, which could be used as a way of following time-restricted feeding, is associated with an increased risk of mortality from cardiovascular and all-cause mortality in the US population. And so, more on from that, it would be very interesting to understand how time-restricted feeding benefits can vary depending on whether the feeding occurred during the morning or evening, so whether or not breakfast time or dinner time was effectively skipped. And I find this most fascinating because if the benefits of time-restricted feeding are supposed to be acting through the circadian rhythm, then I think it 100% makes sense for there to be some difference between whether or not the feeding occurs in the morning or evening. But I really couldn't find any data on that, so I have nothing to say other than the fact that I tend to eat in the morning, but who knows, maybe I'm doing it wrong. So anyway, let's now take a look at some of the effects of periodic fasting on aging. And I'm actually going to focus a little bit more on the fast mimicking diets as opposed to water-only periodic fasting, only due to the fact that periodic fasting, where only water is consumed, has a lot more safety concerns, in particular with those who are already malnourished, as it can lead into, malnourishment, but also rapid weight loss, reduced blood pressure and hypoglycemia, and the exacerbation of existing micronutrient deficiencies. And so this is why fast mimicking diets were developed, as they can also promote the effects of fasting while standardizing dietary composition, providing nourishment and minimizing the burden and these different side effects that can be seen with water-only fasting. And so this takes us back to a paper that came out in 2015 from Folter's lab. A periodic diet that mimics fasting promotes multi-system regeneration, enhanced cognitive performance, and health span. And so this FMD, this fast mimicking diet, that was low in calories and protein, and was fed to the mice starting at 6 months of age for 4 days, twice a month, and in between these different fasting periods, they were eating ad libitum. And so the mice on this diet displayed an 11% increase in their median lifespan, in addition to significant weight and visceral fat loss, but without losing muscle mass. And they also showed that it reduced tumour incidence by 45%. And what they also saw in the mice was that, although they were calorie restricted during the diet, they compensated for the restriction by overeating in the ad libitum period. And Folter goes on to say in this review article about the potential importance of this refeeding process, as it seems the cycles of fasting and then refeeding are powerful promoters of stem cell self-renewal mechanisms and activators of tissue regeneration, in part through inhibition and reactivation of IGF-1 and mTOR pathways. So the idea that you first inhibit these pathways to promote stress resistance, and then when food returns, those pathways get suppressed and growth pathways instead get signaling that allows the regeneration of new tissue. And the evidence for this that was shown in this 2015 paper by Folter is nicely summarised in this review figure, whereby the FMD diet affected tissue regeneration in immune cells, bone cells, brain cells, muscle cells, pancreatic cells, as well as in the intestine. And it's thought that this regeneration in part helps to extend the health span of these mice because it protects the mice against age-related decline in these different tissues. But the important question, or at least, for me, the thing that I find interesting, is how this is happening. Is the changes in the metabolic signalling having epigenetic changes? Or is it changing the stem cell niche, which regulates the activity of the stem cells? And so, as Folter says, the role of regeneration during the refeeding period is poorly understood and should be investigated further in multiple tissues. And the other reason why I think that this is quite interesting, in addition to just understanding the importance of fast mimicking diets, is due to the fact that these different supplements that have been shown to extend lifespan in different model organisms, such as rapamycin and resveratrol, these are acting to inhibit the signalling through these growth pathways. And so what if it's the case that the best thing to do is to have periods of inhibition of growth signalling followed by activation, so actually trying to activate mTOR signalling? Although I guess the best way to do that really is just by food. But yeah, interesting questions. We shall have to await answers. And I didn't say, but there have been human studies that have looked into the impact of FMD. For example, in one study, there was a randomized clinical trial with 100 relatively healthy volunteers that used FMD cycles lasting 5 days, carried out once per month for 3 months. And it was shown to reduce multiple risk factors for age-related diseases, including diabetes, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. However, I'm going to emphasise what Folter says in this review, that although FMDs appear to be safe, their use should be limited to 3 times per year in healthy people with normal levels of disease risk factors until additional and long-term clinical studies demonstrating the safety of more frequent use are carried out. And so this comes back to another question of which fasting mechanism would potentially be more effective: periodic fasting, such as FMD, or intermittent fasting, such as time-restricted feeding. And the thing is, we don't really know enough about either of them or have enough studies to be able to directly compare them. And maybe I've potentially been swayed by Folter's biased opinions on FMD diets. It does seem very interesting, this refeeding process. And so maybe there is some truth in the fact that these more severe fasting, refeeding, do have a better kind of stop-start action on the regenerative processes as opposed to chronic time-restricted feeding. But again, we just don't have the answers yet. And the other area where research is really required is also looking at the age-dependent differences in these different fasting approaches, in addition to different sex-dependent differences, in particular for females and menstruation, but also pregnancy. Well, I don't think it would be advisable to do it during pregnancy. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is diet composition. Whilst it's been well established that low protein seems to be beneficial for longevity, this may only be true up to a certain age, whereby low protein is actually negative and has adverse consequences for health span. And the other thing worth investigating would be how supplements interact with different fasting approaches, as I mentioned earlier. So with that, I hope this has given you some good insight into this review. It was quite long and I probably have condensed it quite a lot, but I hope I've given you the main key take-homes from it. So as always, shout out to my Patreon, Tina, and of course all my other patrons. I'm very grateful for your contributions, and I hope you've learned something, and thanks for listening.